Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Can I Be Blunt, which is a podcast, blog, YouTube series about sex work, BDSM, where I talk with sex workers, professional dominatrices, therapists, lifestyle kinksters about their relationships, online sex work, and BDSM. And so today I'm here with Domina Elara to talk about BDSM and spirituality, concepts of safety in the scene, and playing with newbies. So I would love if you could just start by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about how you got into this scene and maybe a little bit about your domination style.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Domina Elara, and I'm a professional dominatrix. I got into this scene in a kind of roundabout way. When I was a kid, when I was pretty young, I was already very interested and very enthralled by the kink world. I didn't fully understand it at the time. So I would search on the internet shiny people, not understanding that what I was actually looking for was people in latex. And and it wasn't even necessarily for horny reasons. It was just, I really wanted to see them. I just had to look at them.
That sounds very
Yeah.
horny. Just
Yeah,
okay.
probably. I really had to look at them. And I had to look at there were other things I wanted to look at. Women in very tight laced corsets and stockings and garters kind of set up. Like if that's what they were wearing, I was very into it. But I kind of already understood that there was a subversion to it. So if my mom were to walk past the door, I would shut all the browsers. And there was already an inkling in my mind that this was something I couldn't share with people. And I pretty much kept it to myself all the way until like about 8 years ago, actually. So it's actually pretty recent that I finally had a partner who wanted me to flog him. And so I actually had acquired some kink accoutrements already, including a couple of floggers, which I never used before, and finally decided to actually use it on him. And I remember when I was flogging him, I was in a small apartment at the time, and it was kind of late in the night, and I could hear this laughter from my neighbor's house, and I was like, why are they so loud? And then so I was flogging harder and harder, and I heard this laughter just growing, emanating, just resounding in the entire apartment. I was why would anyone be laughing at this hour? What is so funny that my neighbor thinks is so funny? And then kept laughing and laughing, and I was hitting harder and harder, and after a while I was like, oh, I'm laughing. That's me. I'm laughing. And so we started to go to kink events together, and we'd do a scene and people would watch. And the end of one of these, after a few months of doing this, I went to the person who was running it, and at that time was Mistress Viola. And I said, thank you so much for making this wonderful space. It feels very safe, and I really appreciate you. And she looked at me and she had a drink in her hand, and she was like, have you thought of going pro? And I was like, maybe, but let's talk about it. So I became her mentee and Natasha Strange's mentee, and I've been doing this for about 5 years.
That's amazing. I feel like something that really stood out to me, just because I was sort of the opposite, is I'm curious about how the early roots of fetish then came together with some of the corporal play and dominance and submission. Because when I was younger and Googling things, it wasn't shiny people or a specific style. I feel like I was unaware of the word humiliation or tease and denial, and just specifically looking for any sort of woman on top slight teasing vibe and more vanilla porn until I found kink in the kink scene. And then I feel like some of the more fetishy vibe things came for me because I then understood them as an extension of feminine power and as a way to control people. And I'm curious, for you, it sounds like sort of going the other way from fetish attire and shiny people then into more trying on your dominance and embodying it in the scene that you're discussing with your boyfriend, and then going pro. And so I'm curious what that was sort of like.
Yeah. I feel like where my kink and sexual inclinations have sort of kind of ebbed and flowed in different directions. So sometimes it could be as simple as something like my shiny people thing when I was younger, but it can be very surprising to me. It could be something that somebody mentions in conversation and it starts to stir something in my brain. I'm like, oh, huh, I should go investigate that. So it can come in so many different directions to the point where it's so hard for me to place it because it just comes so randomly. But also, I think something that is quite fun is that I feel like now I have a queer kink community and they're very creative. Like everyone is so unique and so effervescent with their like energy and their like kink exploration that everyone's like vividly sharing, oh, this is what I did recently, or I'm so into this, or like, how about this? And it really opens up my mind of like, oh my gosh, yeah, maybe I could be into this. Like, how about I investigate that too? And a lot of I think us sharing with each other without shame has given me so much permission to explore so much kinks even for myself and yeah and even exploring like yeah, so many different things.
Yeah, I do feel like it can be a little bit contagious, especially with just constantly being surrounded by people sharing beautiful content and like beautiful artistic scenes and scene documentation. I really love it when submissives will let me photograph a scene, so because it's so fun to share and be inspired and just share all of the fun things that we get to come up with in our brain and then actually do to people and make real. I feel like is really fun.
Yeah. It's really fun and very like so intimate as well to be able to share this is something I care about. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be kink, but like being fully witnessed by people who are not in scene that you respect or you care about, like, oh, I did this fantastic thing recently. Look at what I did. And then yes, look at this. Look at
It's like bloody and
how
future balls.
exactly like look at this. And people who are the right people are like, oh my gosh, this is brilliant, this is amazing. And being witnessed in that way is beautiful.
It's really interesting. It's making me think too of like what we post on social media as a form of manifestation. I had a woman submissive who was my only submissive at the time who would let me photograph them. And now the majority, at least half of my clients are queer. And I think it is because of the only body that I had that I was photographing and sharing content with was a woman. And so I would have people commenting too on the post, like, this isn't femdom, this is something else because it's not a male body. I'm like, where is the word male and femdom? Why are you
Right.
passive
Or
when you center yourself in like, we're so sorry. But it was
yeah.
really interesting. And I think it was the first time, like a year after posting those photos, I was like, wow, I get so many requests from women in a way that I don't hear many of my peers talking about. And I think it was just because, and a few people were telling me that they just hadn't seen pro doms with woman subs in that way.
Yeah.
And so it
Yeah.
made me think a lot about like what we put out there and how it will then bring more like-minded people to us in a little bit more of an intentional way. And then I had to be like, okay, I need to find a cis dude who will let me photograph him because for a while I didn't have any cis men clients. I had a handful of women and non-binary folks as my regulars, which was great. But I
That sounds amazing.
I feel like I have to remind people I do also like men, so I like that. Yeah.
It's true. I think a lot of people get that a lot of like men and non-binary people don't want to be photographed. And I think there could be a variety of different reasons. And I think also sometimes it actually might be a simple, like, I mean, not just, obvious privacy reasons, but very often if I see a man as a client, they don't have tattoos. They don't have visible, obvious things that can identify them. And I think whenever I do see a woman, they are tattooed or sometimes heavily tattooed is a pretty distinct.
Yeah, I don't know what it was. I just privacy concerns were shifted in some way.
Yeah.
But another thing that you mentioned was mentorship. I'd be so curious to hear you talk about your experience with mentorship. I came up in an old guard leather house, which I found because I was doing very perverted things with someone and had no language for it. And this house gave a talk at a SUNY school, and my friend listened to it about kink and was like, hey, this is going to be so inappropriate, but I need to give you this business card for this kink house that I learned about because it would be remiss of me not to offer you this. And I went there like every other weekend in college and trained more like lifestyle old guard, earned leathers, worked my way through like a submissive to being a dom and then taking sessions and then going out independent. It's a highly problematic place, very interesting, very cult-like. I personally loved it, but definitely on reflection, I have some thoughts about power in mentorship situations. And I'm curious. I feel like I know a lot more people who have kind of like found a dom. This was a man ran the house, which I feel like also gave me a pretty different experience. And I'm curious, and their emphasis wasn't on professional domination. It was like on lifestyle training. And so I'm curious what your experience was finding Natasha, and I forget the other person's name, who you became a mentee of.
I'm actually super curious about your leather house experience, and I'd love to hear about it. I can share about my
Yeah.
experience, and then I'd love to hear about yours if you're willing to share. My mentorship under Mistress Viola and Natasha Strange was a very unique one because I believe that there was at that time no standard mentorship like process. I think what they saw in me was I think what happened might have been just an instinct or a kind of vibe that they got from me, and they're like an intuition. But when it came to the training itself, I would consider it very much a choose your own adventure, which for me works very well. I think I thrive like the best in an environment where I can like sort of choose the way I determine how I learn my process. And so very often what I would do is I would gather questions over a month and write them down and like have this list of questions. And then I would sit with them and be like, okay, how would I do this? And how would I attack this? And how would I handle this? And go about this. And they had a lot of like fantastic like beginner advice for me when I first started, which was extremely insightful and also uh um and like help me sort of, I think, start professionally in a way that I don't think I could have done on my own. Like I wouldn't have had any of the knowledge or skills to have figured it out on my own. I feel like a lot of the times sex work can be like this secret club, and it is kind of, we have to gatekeep a lot of information for safety. So it was very kind of them, very generous of them to be so forthright with, okay, if I were you, I would go about it this way. And there was a lot of safety discussions, but it was very much choose your own adventure. So there were classes that were held at the dungeon, educational classes, which I attended frequently and all the time. And I think Natasha was a big advocate of like, you got to figure out the psychology of a lot of this. And so I really focused on pursuing it, which kind of, I think, like helped a lot of my online content creation, because a lot of it like sits in the brain. It's just a screen. You're watching me. So where I can take you mentally is where the journey is going to go. So I think a lot of it actually has fed into what I do now. And also, like, I think because I do so much online content, a lot of people forget that I started off trying to like working on doing in-person things. But then COVID hit super fast right after that, and I couldn't pursue that. So I just went much deeper into the content creation route. Yeah.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I do feel like having a heavy psychological understanding of BDSM helps with content creation and getting that instead of just creating like very flat fetish content. It can go beyond that and kind of like link the two together, which I find really, really interesting. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
my I don't even know what to call it. My mentorship, my training, my cult indoctrination was very different. I was quite young. I found the house when I was 18 and then went when I was 19. I'm like super open with my family, and my mom was terrified and actually drove me there and sat outside of the house for like 6 hours to make sure I didn't get kicked.
That is so supportive.
Very sweet. She was my safe call for years. She was very, very sweet and very just wanted me to be safe. And like, I think this goes into a question I want to talk about later, but like, no one was surprised when I told them I started doming. They're like, that tracks. You as a child were. My mom tells a story where I asked her why she was so uncomfortable with me asking for what I wanted. And I was like, wouldn't you just say no if you didn't want to give it to me? And like, and why wouldn't you want to give it to me? And she was just like kind of shocked that I felt that way, I think, as like a young girl and as a woman. And she's like, okay, well, good for you. But yeah, I found the place that I trained at 18. And I think because I was so young, I was just kind of like very bright eyed and interested. I was like super horny and very much up for experience. And I'm not particularly submissive, but I am a sadomasochist. So it was fun for me to explore things and explore the old guard style of training where you have things tried on you before then doing them to other people. And my biggest interest is in power and power exchange. And so I, this is maybe my toxic trait, but I really enjoyed watching. It was a very problematic place that I trained in retrospect, and I don't think I was aware of it, but I enjoyed watching the male dom try and exert power over me in a way that it didn't work. And I enjoyed that resistance, and I feel like I had very strong relationships with my home and with family and with friendships. And they weren't able to like isolate me the same way that in retrospect they were doing to other people. So I feel like I had a better experience than quite a few people I've spoken to. But it was, I'd go there like every other weekend. They'd have a party once a month. I was like a highlight, like the mistress in training. And in retrospect, I probably should have getting paid for what I was doing. But it was a really interesting space. Like there were people there in 50-year DS dynamics who were part of the extended leather family who like came up when there were not a lot of like rules or people you were like accountable to in the scene and just kind of like making it up for themselves. And yeah, and like real ownership happening. And so that's always what my interest was. And I found it to be a little bit of like professional hindrance because I am really interested in those like deep DS dynamics. And I was chatting with someone on a fan site and they were like, ma'am, I'm just trying to jerk off. I'm like, okay. Like, I'm interested in getting to know you and seeing if we gel. He's like, man, this is an Arby's. Like, let me just jerk off.
Let me jerk.
Yeah, and I was like, okay, I appreciate the redirect. Thank you. Yeah, so they did not train me to be a professional dominatrix. They trained me to be a lifestyle dominatrix. And when I finished working a production assistant job and then did a pro dom session and made the same amount in a month as I did in 2 hour session, I was like, okay, I'm never having a civvy job again. And then I had to sort of figure out all of the like safety things and all of the where do you find a dungeon and all of the more like logistical side of sex work on my own because they really did not prepare me for it being a successful business. Yeah, very interesting space.
That is such a amazing experience.
Yeah, it was, think of it largely as a good experience. And I also like to say that a lot of what I learned about power was through watching it be misused in this space and like what I don't want to replicate in my DS dynamics, which I think is a very powerful way to learn, but also I feel like I learned about what I like about Old Guard and that I want to take with me into my relationships and what of it I just don't ever need to touch or am very uninterested in. But it's very different. I think it was a good fit for me because, like I said, I was interested less in like fetish or a specific activity or bondage or something like that and was very interested in power from a very, very young age. And I think I just kind of lucked into finding a place that was also at the core. It was a very chaotic experience. Like there was no training regimen. It wasn't like, where are your questions? It was like, oh, hey, Blunt, do you want to sew this person's hand into a submissive posture to their thigh? And I'm like, okay. Then they just, have people who were willing and kind of show me how to do it. So I feel like I was doing that before I could Florentine flog, It just was sort of all over the place.
How like learning to like sew somebody's hands to their legs before you learn how to Florentine is, yeah, a very interesting like way of progressing through your kink
Yeah,
technical skills. But
it was
wow.
a chaotic
Yes.
for sure. I'm curious about, I feel like we talked a little bit about it with some of our roots, but what characteristics do you notice in yourself that make you feel particularly well suited to this as like a lifestyle and as a job as a professional?
I think that the one that keeps resounding that always feels true no matter the situation is empathy.
Mm.
Um and uh yeah, I think it comes back to trying to be present and fully witness somebody as how they want to be seen. And it's funny, I feel like those are the best traits of me in my civilian life that come out maybe tenfold in my kink experiences where everything seems to melt away and I'm just in this moment with this person. I feel like there are other characteristics of like, being personable or, things that or even like things from my corporate experience that like um is very helpful in a client facing kind of like interaction. But I think the most important one for me, I think would be empathy.
I like that
Yeah.
answer a lot. I feel like empathy and sadism aren't things that we often hear spoken about in the same breath. And I think like to do professional sadism well and not sadism for the point of like totally destroying someone to the point where they will never be able to recohere in any positive way. I do feel like empathy is such an important part of it. I feel like part of my what I appreciate about my old guard training is knowing what things feel like in my body as that form of somatic empathy of like understanding where someone's at, like why someone might say yes to something it seems like they like actually should be saying no to, and being able to fall in with someone's nervous system is something I really enjoy about the scene, and how you were talking about like how it shows up tenfold in that space. I really appreciate and resonate with, because I think there's something so beautiful about the demarcated beginning and end of a scene and the intentionality that goes into it that does make what happens in a scene transform everyday life, and the way that like you can't really show up to in everyday life because it is such a focused form of attention, such a focused form of empathy, and such a focused form of like falling into someone's nervous system to like, provide almost perfect attunement. I feel like we're getting to the mommy for people who are interested in that. We have questions about mommies as well, but I feel like that empathy and perfect attunement are not states that you can remain in 100% of the time to that extent that allows you to direct the scene really.
Yeah, it is a very challenging state to be in for a super extended period of time because it does take a lot out of you, but it is such a real connection when you do have it with people. Uh I a set that I played with recently after our scene like wrote to me, in your eyes I see compassion and calculation. And I was like, oh yeah, because that's exactly what's happening. Because I'm listening so carefully, and I know you do too in your scenes where like we're just in that moment trying to read what's happening, and wordlessly too, right? Where we're doing this without like necessarily verbal kind of affirmations or confirmations, but mostly sometimes even just the sound of a breath, the like and the slight narrowing of the eye, or we're reading someone so closely, and also I think there is something also for a sub, like just because you're blindfolded doesn't mean I can't read what's going on. Like this part of your face is actually more emotionally responsive than this part of your face. I can read a lot in that moment. And I think that they sense it too because they feel very witnessed. And a lot of people, and especially men, I feel actually, don't experience the joy of being very, very witnessed. Uh, um, and experience the joy, the safety, the feeling of that. I think partially because of the lack of the kind of like social kind of circles that they have compared to a lot of women or like queer folks who have different kinds of community friendships. So yeah, it ends up being very, very special.
Yeah, I feel like men both occupy this space of power and taking up a tremendous amount of space, as well as that space being very difficult to connect with and just like a mask and a shield from the more intimate parts of their life. It's something I definitely see a lot in my work of having men break down in session. And one of the questions I ask on my contact form is, when is the last time you cried? And the gender difference in this question is tremendous. I would say the majority of men, it's like a few years ago, a parent's funeral, a pet's funeral. And
Yeah.
much more diverse answers with everyone else. So I find that super interesting, and the ability to just like hold space for someone. I think I'm super interested in chatting about, I feel like when a scene goes well, someone feels like you're reading them better than they can read themselves, is something that I've been told in sessions of like, how did you know that I wanted that? Did you plant that idea in my head, or is that actually my desire? Yes. Or like, how did you know that I wanted you to stop and you did, and I didn't say anything? And I think there are so many different ways to do that. And I often will start my sessions with breath work, with yoga, pranayama, and meditation, and end it in a similar way. And then I use that time to tap into the breath of someone else, so that when it deviates from that like more regular, relaxed cadence, I can feel it with them. And I often
Brilliant.
feel, yeah, I'm not sure if it's like, it's almost like
Fantastic.
somatic empathy of when I'm like totally tuned in. It's like I'm not physically feeling what's happening with someone, but I feel like along with them on the journey when I feel like in my peak dominant space. And it's one of the reasons I don't offer mentorship, thinking of mentorship, because I'm like, so much of it for me is intuition, empathy, and a somatic bodily feel that I haven't found a person to be able to communicate it. And I just don't think I'm doing enough. I work very low volume with a very select group of people that I don't think I would have like enough for someone to join in to get the robustness of experience. But it's also something that I find difficult to put into language of like what specifically is happening or what I'm doing, because it feels so intuitive to me.
Yeah, it almost feels like an intangible quality, right? Like this, it's almost hard to define exactly how to nail. But obviously, you found your own way through, years of experience and exploration, and finding this special way of reading people that has become so part of your own practice. Yeah, I understand. There are some intangible things like in this very special connection that happens in a scene that I think people have talked about what it feels like, but to nail how to create it is really challenging.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess we're also talking a little bit about top space, it sounds like, of both the like the flow of top space and falling into that rhythm of nothing else existing and besides the link between you and your submissive. And I do find it to be so ephemeral and difficult to verbalize, but there's something that's so powerful. I think so much of it is just monotasking, and that's what happens. That type of attention, like top space or subspace, is only possible when you're monotasking. And I think my background as a yoga teacher really informed a lot of my practice with ways that I can kind of read a room when I'm teaching yoga. And I actually, when I did my 500-hour yoga teacher training, I wrote about some of the parallels between BDSM and yoga for my final project, which was really fun. Um,
That's
and
really
I, yeah, because all of the like us, there's asanas for submission, there are mantras for submission, there are mudras for submission. And specifically when I would read the Tantra Sutras, I think his name is Lauren Roche, the Radiance Sutras. And there are these really beautiful translations about like becoming everything and nothing. And all of them are sort of about tearing yourself open and approaching both like pleasure and pain with the same attention. And I feel like that has informed my practice so much. And I also know you have a spiritual practice, and I would love to hear a little bit about that and how it relates to your kink as well.
yeah. Practice a lot of Buddhist philosophies. I don't consider myself a Buddhist because I don't haven't accepted the 5 precepts yet, because I don't know how to deal with the one that like doesn't really want like kind of like sexual deviance or whatever. So that one, like, I don't know about you. So I don't claim myself to be a Buddhist, but I follow a lot of Buddhist teachings. Like, I think for a long time I was considering a lot of the mesmerized clips I was doing, which is hypnosis. Credit cards, just don't want to talk about it. But I really actually like that, making those clips, because a lot of it I think is I take a lot of people through like different meditative breathing practices, and and I even do this with pop.
Pranayama. It's breath work.
It's breathing. It's
Yeah.
breathing exercises, but you have, you have poppers with you. But like, I can make people go like way deep with breathing or with poppers, using different and various breathing techniques with less product, so they'll hurt less. So I feel very skilled in there. But like, unfortunately I cannot make a lot of videos about it because it's a banned content. But like, if people play with me like online, like over like like a cam call or something, that's something that like I can explore with them, and it's often really fun. But yeah, there's a lot of like meditation breathing things that I do to take people deeper into a different altered headspace, or even to a more grounded space in their body, because a lot of us are not actually in our body on a daily basis. So being able to pull people back with breathing, with different kinds of meditation breathing, and also allowing people to, I feel like a lot of erotic hypnosis can be guided meditation, and I feel like I have to be careful as well when I do this, because I can fall into an altered state when I'm, say, I don't know if you've experienced this. I'm doing a countdown and I'm like, oh no, I'm slipping in. I'm like, oh no, I gotta pull myself back, because I genuinely believe that it works, and also if you do more of it, you just slip into it easier. And also, what a gift. Personally, I feel like what a gift to be able to give someone. I think about, like, I was talking to another Dom who's a lifestyle Dom, and he was saying, I love giving people the gift of submission. And I was like, yeah, I love people. I love being able to do that too. But I also love to be able to bring people and give people the gift of being fully present with their body, or being sent into an altered state. And some of my, and so that's like purely, I guess, in the breathing or in the meditative kind of aspect of it. From like a kind of, from the other aspect of it, I think that a lot of my practice has informed me about compassion, and that ultimately at the end of the day, we are all suffering. It doesn't matter what you are, or who you are, or like whether you think your suffering is more than somebody else's suffering. We are all suffering. And it has, funnily enough, like the practice of BDSM, I think I got into this being very, initially the headspace of being very frustrated with men, you know? Um, like, I know that the people who casually use the phrase, I hate men and everything. And I would too, because I genuinely felt that at the time. There was a lot of anger, I think, in my body for a long time in my 20s, uh, towards men. And there were so many reasons for it, and so many of them very, very valid, I promise you. But funnily enough, it is doing like femdom professionally, it has actually, and following a more spiritual practice has actually given me more space to be more empathetic towards men, and be able to be like, oh no, you are suffering, we are all suffering. And I think has allowed me to hold a much more compassionate space towards men in general.
Better be careful. You might get canceled from femdom Twitter for that statement.
If I get canceled for being able to show compassion and empathy, that is actually okay with me. Like, that is also aligned with my practice. I'm okay with that.
I'm like, do I have compassion? No, I do think it's just so interesting thinking about sadism and compassion, and sadism and empathy. And I think a lot of the work of my friend Abgi Sakatapalu, who writes about exigent sadism, a type of sadism that is not meant to destroy, but like for growth or a better purpose. And I think that also kind of aligns with a lot of what I feel like I don't know a ton about Buddhism, but about what I know about yoga too, is that suffering is part of life. And the Radiant Sutras that I was talking about give so many opportunities to like lean deeply into that suffering and to meditate on that suffering as a form of reaching the divine. And I really, really enjoy that about BDSM sessions, that it can be, especially like bringing in pleasure and torture and all of these other sensations. And it's like, no matter what I'm doing to you, your job is to be fully present with that. And it's also what I love about erotic hypnosis, like femdom POV clips, is being able to induce people into an altered state. And I think in my work, I think a lot about neuroplasticity and the way that society forces us outside of our body in so many ways. Capitalism forces us outside of our body and benefits when we are completely disembodied and unaware of how long we're working and unaware that our body has needs and that our spirit has needs as well. And in this space, I think there's so much space to make space in the brain and to create new pathways for people from where they normally go. And I think specifically with playing with shame, being able to have an experience of meditating on your shame and your humiliation and being able to have an outcome that is not one of ostracization, but of being held and being seen and being witnessed with compassion, I think really does carve out a different ending and creates a different story that you can tell yourself about those like very real and understandable feelings about shame, that isn't one of like losing access to something, but one that brings you closer through your shared vulnerability. And I think that I don't know, I think that's the part I like about making Dom POV clips. And I have like some cult indoctrination series from my training, from my cult indoctrination, as well as some submissive guided hypnosis, mesmerize. I fucking hate that we have to call it mesmerize. And like, what about good old fashioned hypnosis? Like, let's call it what it is. And yeah, I use a lot of breath work in my practices and prompts to facilitate submission. And I think it is very, I don't know, I feel like we just keep coming back to this space of, which feels, I feel like for a lot of people, counterintuitive to the sadist as the dom, but creating a soft and vulnerable place to destroy and recohere someone and bring the pieces back together in a way that is, I like to talk about how I remake people in my image. I like to use a lot of my background in Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, I feel like also shows up in some of my work. And there's this really beautiful myth, which I'm sure I'll butcher, about Tikkun Olam, the idea that being that when God created the universe, it was like a glass bulb and it shattered, and a piece of God's light or the divine was in everyone. And through doing community service or being together and doing like acts of goodwill, that is when the Messiah will come, is when all of those pieces of like the world are brought together through a community. And I like thinking of my clips as like infecting someone with a spark of the divine, and all of my submissives having like a little spark of my divinity within them. And through doing good for Mistress, that is how peace of nerve is brought about.
I love this. This is fantastic. I like that a lot. Gosh, something you mentioned about like, you know, pain and sadism and spirituality really kind of clicked in my brain for me about how I think not just only in Buddhism, I think in other religions too, there is this okay, so in Buddhism, there's the belief that we are all suffering, right? We're all suffering. And the hope is if we hit enlightenment, or if we get to enlightenment, we will escape the cycle of suffering. And one of the ways in my practice is to sit with my suffering. And a lot of meditation is sitting with your suffering, you know? And because I don't know if you heard the thing where like, if you don't learn the lessons in this lifetime, you are bound to repeat them in the next lifetime. Like example, if you do this, like if you don't heal some of the ways you manage like a romantic relationship, you're going to probably carry it on to the next romantic relationship until you figure that shit out and you heal and whatever. Same logic. My theory is that and if in line with, you know, in line with this whole Buddhist philosophy of sitting with our own suffering, is that we need to experience and fully sit with our own suffering so we can learn from our suffering, and so we don't perpetuate and keep cycling our suffering. And my theory of us bringing people through extreme amounts of pain or something of sadism in a scene is for them to experience the suffering that they have accumulated, or like, over time, that they are already suffering. But in that moment in the scene, when we put them in a scene, we force them to fully experience it. It is inescapable. Like if someone is bound down and they are being beaten like super hard, they are fully experiencing their suffering in that moment. They cannot run away from that suffering. And in so doing, they fully embody it, fully process it, and then at the end can cry about it and then feel the relief of what it is to feel their suffering fully and get through the very end, which is the whole point of a lot of meditation. And so I think it's actually really important as a kind of personal practice for a lot of people, where they're like, oh, I have to go and I have to go cry now and I have to see a dom to do that. And I'm like, yeah, because it's so hard for us to access that suffering on our own. Like I can sit down and meditate for a lot of time, but it doesn't necessarily mean I'll be able to even touch that suffering. Sometimes I'm so distant from it. It's so removed from me that I can't feel it anymore. I can't fully process it. And the only way for me to fully feel it is for somebody to force me to experience it in that moment where it is truly inescapable. So this is my I don't know. This is my theory of what's happening.
I mean, it makes total sense to me too. I think also like of maybe a more maladaptive coping strategy of cutting. I feel like the way that psychologists understand cutting is to make suffering manifest, like make it visible, to make it seen, to possibly like share that. And I think that a healthier way is would be like seeing a pro dom, but
Yeah.
I I think that there's something really beautiful about providing space to make that suffering visible, that suffering that everyone is experiencing, and what is possible when you sit with it. And like as you were talking about, and then holding space for that, I think it becomes like able to be integrated in a way where when you're not processing it somatically. I actually do a lot of work with therapists. I've given like trainings to therapists, I've interviewed therapists, I've taught it at teaching hospitals, both about sex work and BDSM. And I have one interview up on Psychology Today about kinky yoga and a practice that I was offering a while ago. And I really thought I thought psychologists were going to refer their patients to me, but I wound up just having like 10 therapists book me this 1 month that this article came out. And I was like, okay, y'all are kinky as fuck. And I've also had people's therapists tell them that, like, since seeing me, their therapy has kind of has progressed at a significantly faster pace. I try and encourage most of my submissives who are seeing me like on a long-term basis to be seeing a kink aware therapist, because while I think talk therapy is like incredibly limited in what it can do, I think it's very effective for finding language, especially for men who don't have that space necessarily to talk about their feelings, where there's a word, I think it's traditional or typical male alexithymia, which alexithymia is the inability to feel or articulate your feelings. It is a trait often associated with autism, but various types of neurodivergent people experience alexithymia, and because of socialization, large proportion of men experience the difficulty or inability to name their feelings. And so I think that's where talk therapy can come in handy. But I also think it can, because you're not putting things in the body, things just happen so much faster. And I don't know if this is something you've seen in your practice too, but someone who's working through something comes and has that experiencing of getting in touch with their suffering in a somatic and embodied way, and just is then able to move through different aspects of their life with more grace or differently, or like interrupting, as you're talking about, that cycle of suffering, that cycle of how they're approaching relationships, and being able to have more access to make different decisions.
Yeah, I've definitely had somebody tell me that, wow, like I think they had 1 or 2 kink sessions with me. They're like, I wish this basically was my 7 years of therapy, like all in 2 hours. And I'm like, everyone is so different. And I'm a big advocate for kink, but I also don't think that everybody needs kink. It works for me. It works for a lot of people that I see, obviously. But I think that obviously kink can be approached in so many ways. It can be approached in horny ways, which are so fun, but also in very like deeply therapeutic ways. Um, and I hope and wish that more people would understand that it is not necessarily your only option or only solution. Like you can layer on your own personal practice so that you can live the life you want to live. You can have talk therapy, you can have kink, you can have dance, you can have like, there's so many things that you can incorporate into your life that can contribute to you being the full, wonderful, dynamic person that you want to be. Unfortunately, I don't think there's any one thing that just makes everything right for like a single person. I think we need a multitude of different things, which feels really, really hard in our very capitalistic, kind of world. Because like, where do you have the time to do all the different things? So it's really hard for a lot of people. But I'm really happy that you encouraged, your long-term subs to go for talk therapy too, because it really does layer on your experience and truly like give you a fuller life. And by fuller life, I don't mean like you're doing more things in your life, but more like you can exist in the world as the multi-colorful, dimensional person that has always been you.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think there's something for me too about, especially when working with men, I feel like a lot of my male submissives and clients don't have the same community that my queer clients do.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that there's something that's very important about your Dom not being the only person that you talk to about your kink dynamic, and like the added element of safety of like having someone who you can talk about your experiences with and process them that's not the person who's doing it to you makes me feel safer that they're processing it and going to be able to talk to me about something if it goes wrong. I think, and maybe this is a good segue into something else we wanted to chat a little bit about, which is the idea of safety in a scene and how so many DS role plays sort of like pervert or undo this feeling of safety. And we're talking about therapy, so maybe now's a great time to shout out to our therapy clip. I'm finishing filming right now an erectile dysfunction therapy clip, which I am very excited
Love.
for.
Hmm.
I did a ton of research for this one, so it is based in science. um,
Good
not that
for you. We
I,
love a little bit of truth,
yeah,
you know?
there's always truth hurts the most, so why not just go there? But yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you think about safety within a BDSM scene. And when I think about safety, I think of it largely as like a potential, I don't even want to say ideal. I actually think not being safe is where we grow the most. But I think when we feel safe, more is possible within the realm of what already exists. And when we feel secure, feeling unsafe, I think that's when new possibilities are possible. So I'm curious how you play with safety and unsafety and some of the content you make and some of the scenes that you.
I think that I think I approach it all very differently. I think online I really enjoy playing with the subversion of relationships that's supposed to feel safe, but then end up being subverted or perverted into a way that it is actually unsafe. So I have gone through so many years of therapy that I decided to create a series of like 6 psychologist clips. You can't use therapy or therapists on websites, but you can use psychologists. So I don't know. So my 6 psychologists will, very often start off feeling very, very normal, and lure you into this sense of safety of like, normal, interactions. But then after a while, it feels like it starts to get a little bit inappropriate. It starts to get more inappropriate. And after a while, as a viewer, you realize you're doing something extremely inappropriate in a sex psychologist's office, but you don't. But she asks for it. So is that okay? And is that safe? And is that all right? Um, and then basically ends off with a certain level of unease and confusion. I really enjoy this kind of interactions because I think it might be just my own kink of like having sat through so many years of therapy and wanting to like pervert something to me that has always been very safe to me. But I've always been a person who has enjoyed sort of like towing the lines of what is allowed and what is not allowed. So, if you give me, I'm
Or
I'm
like,
very
you
good.
your therapist boundary.
If you accidentally saw her underwear because she was crossing her legs in a certain way, like, do you say something? I mean, you probably shouldn't say something, right? And so it just keeps encroaching a little bit further until suddenly you're like, your dick is out, and then you're like, doing stuff, and you're like, what? I don't know if this is okay. I don't know. So the thing is, this kind of like frog in hot water kind of environment where it just sort of gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And here they are. But no one's ever upset about the situation. You're just only concerned whether like you have crossed a boundary or not. And so I think that that's the fun toe of line that I like to play. And also, I don't know, like something about that feels very taboo to me and feel like it feels very sexy in my brain. How is it for you when you make your clips?
Well, I really like how you were describing that too, because there's like the research behind flow state is that something should be like familiar enough, safe enough, but then challenging enough that it puts you into this altered space. And that is the flow of addiction when you're gambling. It's the flow of really getting into like a hypnotic space. And it sounds like you're doing something similar in the therapist thing when you're sort of gauging how much safety and unsafety, bringing someone into like feeling safe and comfortable, and then slowly challenging them of what that concept of that space is, which I find really interesting, and just like another way that humiliation and shame can be used to induce an altered state like that, of that like that not knowing but being so entranced that you can't say no, you can't stop, you're so into it, like you can't take your hand off your dick, you just are following what you're told because of how, right, like I think what I'm also saying is like seduction is a process of bringing people into an altered state as well, and I think you described that very well.
I like that. I'm gonna have to like think about that for a while. That's great. I like it.
I think maybe I definitely have some psychology clips, which I guess I can't call therapy.
Like psychologist.
But I think I do a lot of playing with safety and unsafety with my role as mommy. I would say is
Oh.
the most of like mommy being this space that is supposed to be like perfect attunement. You're perfectly ideal. You're like perfectly attached, and there's so much room to play with someone when you do get them into that feeling of like perfect safety, perfect attachment, perfect attunement. Like, I know what you need better than you do. And then using that to then pervert the dynamic, which I really like to do, is you exist solely for mommy's pleasure. There is nothing about you that is outside of mommy. You are of mommy. Mommy made you. Mommy can destroy you. Every thought you have should revolve around mommy. And mommy's going to make you do these things that a mommy probably shouldn't, but you're going to get very excited by this. And then that shame, the role that shame plays in it. And so I think I have a very nurturing mommy role with some people, and like a very, very sadistic mommy role. I haven't made this one yet, but I really want to do like a Munchausen mommies clip where mommy's making you sick, making you stay home and just keep jerking off over and over again, and like taking you to the doctor. I want to do that one in person too.
Whoa,
Like,
that's
yeah.
so messed up.
Oh, you have a fever. Just stay home with mommy all day. Like, you're not allowed to go to school until you feel better. And we're going to just keep going to the doctor's appointments. Ideally, a little forced intox too for my fantasy, just to like,
Oh, no, this is good. I like it.
um, but
Yeah,
yeah,
I like this like bubble boy kind of situation.
yeah, mommy's little bubble boy.
Yeah, I love that.
I feel like another thing we chatted about talking about was seeing both newbies and doms. And I don't, and well, I'll let you bring it up because I'm not sure, but mommy seeking mommies. So I feel like that's my problem.
Okay. So if I had a speciality, I think for in-person sessions is I'm a great first provider for people who've never done kink before. I feel like I'm very patient. I'm very compassionate. I'm very intuitive. I'm very empathetic, and I'm very happy to walk people through a lot of their anxieties. because I'm actually very familiar with them because I seek providers too. So I know the process and what like the different snags where you're like, oh, I get really nervous here because I have experienced them too. And it's so wonderful because this year I've had so many people like their first in-person kink experience has been with me and they've seen me again and again, or they plan to see me again and again. And it's for me, it's very emotionally rewarding to be able to be that first safe person that they see, because I feel like your first experience can really change how you feel about anything. I think I know of somebody who had a very bad first therapist experience, and so now they've sworn off all kind of talk therapy forever. And I'm like, oh, well, that's so affecting. And I'm sure people, if they had a really bad or even lukewarm, kind of kink first experience, they could be like, well, I guess it's not for me. I'm like, no, you're here. There's something about it you're curious about. We'll find it. Don't worry. And I'm also very good at like with people who have a very undefined start. They're like, I don't really know why I'm here. I'm like, oh, don't worry, I'll find it. I'm like, don't worry, you don't know. It's okay. You just have a curiosity. I'll find it. I'll find it inside you. And so far, I've always been right. So
like 100% success rate.
yeah, I actually really love being somebody like first dom. It's very emotionally rewarding for me, and I get a lot of pleasure from it. And it seems like people really enjoy it themselves. And a lot of these people, their first time is they were an online, person who had only experienced femdom online, and then finally they're like, okay, I want to do in person, but you're going to be my in-person person. And I'm like, that's fine. And then let's do it. And they've been like, wow, I can't believe I've waited my whole life to do
I feel
this.
like
And I'm
that's
like,
what so many people say.
I would wait. I'm like, that's okay, That's why I'm always so charmed when somebody's like in their 20s and they come and find me, and I'm like, you've got your whole life ahead of you. Don't even worry about it. Like, you're just, so exciting.
I feel like it's never too late to like
Never, absolutely. Like
so many more young people coming to see me, and I really love newbies. I feel like I have a very old guard, been around in the industry for like 16 years, that people will often look at my content for like years before booking me. So I feel like I have the experience.
yeah.
Sometimes I'm their first, but I really do love, well, I'm a mommy. Of course, like I want you to be a first. that's a lot of But yeah, I think like I've also hired professionals before, and my coming up story, like bottoming and sadomasochism, I need a biannual beating to remain humble, is it keeps me sane. But I remember the first time I hired a pro, she asked for her gift, and I've always called it a tribute. And I was like, oh my God, I didn't bring you a gift. Oh my
I didn't bring you wine. I was sorry.
Dad. And then she's like the cash, and I was like, oh my God, I'm deeply humiliated. I just like recently had so much more compassion for how anxious people are and the weird little things that people will do when they're anxious just because they don't have familiarity with how like the specifics or even like how an individual runs their sessions. And I honestly think most should hire someone at some point, just like for the being on the receiving end of being a client. I think has taught me so much about my professional domination practice as well.
Yeah, it can be really stressful and really scary. I feel like, so I also hire pros, and like even from the moment of filling in that application form, I'm so anxious, and I have to run it by my kinky best friend and be like, okay, do I sound all right? And they're like, no, I think you should change. I'm like, oh no, that's really smart. And I become like, I'm like, I can't. Oh my gosh. And then they're like, you've been sitting on. Yeah. And like, so funny because I do get very, very anxious. And it's so funny because I may have interacted with this pro before in a normal, like human setting and we're fine. But when I'm in the state where I'm applying to see them to have, I'd like to do a session with you, I can get so anxious and it's so terrifying. And I'm so grateful for any of the people I've seen who have like made like the process of like, okay, this is what you do. This is what to anticipate. This is what we're going to do. And I've like incorporated so much of that into my practice too. So like, that's why I think newbies find a lot of comfort in like, oh, okay, because they have no idea what's happening, right? This is not like a doctor visit. it doesn't make any sense, you know? Like, uh, it's so funny. Yeah.
I also, speaking of safety and unsafety, I like newbies who are like we're open. And I feel like you were talking about it, like I will let you figure out what you're interested in. And I'm like, this is what mommy is interested in. Here, what a coincidence. It just turns out that you're interested in this too. Like how incredible. And I had a really lovely dynamic with someone that I trained online on my fan sites for years and watched them like slowly start exploring the kink scene. So I wasn't the first Dom that they saw, but by the time they came to me, they had a little bit of experience and it was so fun to like pervert them further and have like all of that anticipation and build up from seeing photos from their sessions that they were doing with other people and like hearing that like other doms were talking about how well trained they were and like all of these
Mhm.
like little tidbits I felt like were so fun just like watching that growth too.
It is really fun to watch when somebody like started off here in their perversion and now they're like all the way over there. It is so joyful. I think it's like one of the most exhilarating things where it's like, oh, you know, I really enjoy it when like somebody's open enough to more perversion, to more kinks, more interesting, more different kind of like eroticism so that they can enjoy such a wide buffet of experiences. It's just it's so fun. It's so rewarding. I'm like, oh, gave you a new one.
That
Mhm. Yeah,
every time you see this you're gonna think of me.
it's
It's
really
perfect.
fun.
Okay, well I feel like I could chat with you forever, but is there anything else you wanted to mention before we wrap up our time?
Hmm. I think that I guess the main thing I would say is that if you're a person like a sub who is online and things and have kind of like always been excited to see an in-person dom, just like book and see what happens. And I'm also going to be honest and say that in-person and purely content creating doms have different skill sets and all are valid, right? Because now, you know, I actively do both. I think this year, I think I've toured the most with my in-person things because I feel like I feel more comfortable with COVID things that than I did before. But when you decide to book an in-person dom for the first time, you're going to be nervous, and that's okay. And we know that, and then you're going to be fine. You know, it's okay. I would say go and do it and try it, and also choose your dom wisely because like the skills I use to shoot online content is very different from the skills I do for in-person experiences. It's like the difference between someone who is an engineer on paper and someone who's a car mechanic. Does that make sense? Like you might sit down and be able to do all the mathematical things about it, but if you were presented with a car and go and fix the engine right now, it doesn't necessarily mean you can do it because it requires a different set of skills. Both are important and both are valid. And so ask yourself what kind of in-person experience you're looking for and, you know, find the appropriate dom with the appropriate experience to be able to give you that, to guarantee that you can have a really great first experience. And also everyone does it differently. Just because I do something this way doesn't mean 20 of them after me will do the same. So yeah,
I feel
just
like finding
encouraging more people to lean into it.
yeah, I feel like assessing fit too is so like what type of experience are you are you interested in? Because not every dom like I feel like there's so much subtlety in all of our marketing and branding to so that we can connect with the right people. And I feel like as I've like filtered and tailored my marketing, the more barriers to entry that I've been able to erect as I do better and better in the industry, the more selective I've been able to be as well. But I do think we share so much in our marketing and in our contact forms where really get like the flavor of if you think you would be a good fit or what type of session that you want. And I totally agree with you with online skill set being so different. I think it's reminding me of the excuse me, ma'am, like I'm just trying to jerk off. Because
Right.
it's so different. Like I'm so used to like 15 years of in-person work before I did anything extensive online. And it was a very different switch for me. It was like learning an entirely different skill set. And I still seek to have those more like one-on-one experience rather than just casting like a super broad net has never been my interest. And so I actually do approach my online work much more like my in-person practice of like developing one-on-one relationships. And I have a handful of very devoted submissives who have been with me through like out the entirety of my time that I've been more active online, that I run the relationship very similar to how I would in person, and run cam calls very similar to like how I would in person, because that's what I'm familiar with and what I know. But it is very different. The difference between like just exclusively talking to a camera and engaging, I don't know, from what we've talked about in this, from like hearing someone's breath and being able to make a decision based on how that breath or like that look or their body temperature might have shifted in like a microsecond is a very different skill set for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you are not an Arby's, that you are uniquely you, and that the way you have your kink dynamics like translates into so much relationship building is what I'm hearing. And it sounds like this aligns with you so well and so meaningfully, and and you attract that kind of people back into your life, which I think is so meaningful. That's fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, I really enjoy it. And I enjoy, as you're saying, like the relational dynamic and being able to build those relationships. 'Cause that's where I really find that there's that space for growth and self-knowledge.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I love that.
And I loved hearing about the spiritual side of your practice. I feel like we're very aligned on our approach to the power of in person and the power of falling in and creating that space.
Yeah, like the more I do it, I think I've done more in person this year than I've done for all my other years of doing this. And I found myself falling so much more in love with it than I do with in person, because I like that connection and I like what I bring to it. And I've attracted, I think, a very specific subset of people that we align extremely well with. And it has just been so incredibly rewarding that I want to do and keep pursuing more in person things as well next year. But it's been really, really joyful. Yeah, I'm
I love
happy
that.
about
I
it.
love that we can have so many different like facets of our career, and like when we're burnt out on one thing, we can like lean more deeply into another, or just like when our interest and shifts our
Yeah.
interest change, we can, I don't know, it's nice. I've enjoyed that about content making, of being able to be like, oh, like I want to do less of this, or I want to do more of that, and just be able to like sort of do whatever feels best for you at the time. If folks
Yeah.
find you, where can they find you?
So I'm on Blue Sky and on Twitter as Domina Elara. I'm on Instagram as Dominatrix Elara. Who knows how long that's going to be there. And my website is dominatrixelara.com, or you can find more information at dominaelara.com. And I am on all major clip sites, and I release a lot of clips every week. But I'm most active in my fan sites like Loyal Fans.
And if you want to
Yeah.
find me, Google Mistress Blunt, because who knows what site will be up or down. But it's all. Um, well, it was so lovely chatting with you, and we should probably do this again.
Yeah, I really enjoy that. Thank you so much for your graciousness, your lovely energy and your insightful questions. Thank you so much. It was really wonderful spending time with you.
See.